Tonight we are observing the Yortzeit Hilula of the Alter Rebbe, Balatanya, Shulchan Aruch. Change the lighting. Okay. That's the Oyer of Shnei Oyer. The Alter Rebbe was the Pesach in Nigla and in Nister, as is implied by his name Shnei Oyer, the two lights. And his two great works, the Tanya, which is the Teireh Shebechsav of Chassidus, and the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which is his revision and new presentation of the halachas of Shulchan Aruch. Tonight's presentation is chiefly a biographical look at the life of the Alter Rebbe, and more specifically at one very particular tekufa, or period in the life of the Alter Rebbe, the months, roughly about 140 days leading up to the event that we commemorate tonight. So we're going to be speaking about focusing on the last few months of the Alter Rebbe's life. Before we do so, I just wanted to share an idea, a thought, a Torah thought. Happens to be, you hear something good and you want to share it. You know, it's like some people, money burns a hole in their pocket. Others, you hear a good vort and you have to share it. So Shabbos, I was actually in Crown Heights. They had the young professionals Shabbaton. So I was able to get away for a little bit and daven in 770. And Friday night, Chaim Sholbrook from Lahak came over and he opened up the Tanya to that day's Chitas, which was that Friday, just a few days ago, which is the end of Perek Yud Gimel. And he pointed something out to me, and I want to share it with you. In the end of Perek Yud Gimel of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe is speaking about how a Beinani, a regular person, if he'll really work, he can get himself into that zone where he's feeling Avas Hashem. He's really feeling love of Hashem, and his Nefesh Habamis is asleep, and it's not bothering him. There's no distractions. There's no nothing. And it's as if he were a tzaddik in that moment. Then the question, though, becomes, is that Avas Hashem authentic or not? Now, why? Why would you question that? Because there's a general concept. You know, I think it was Mark Twain who said, if you never lie, you never have to remember anything. Right? What does that mean? Is that a lie is different every time. So you have to, every time somebody asks you, you have to remember what you said last time to make sure that it'll be consistent. But if you always tell the truth, then you're always going to be consistent, because the truth never changes. The truth is the truth. This is what King Solomon, the wisest of all men, also said. He said, Sfas emes, the language of truth, tikun la'ad, it endures forever. Whereas in contrast, v'dargia loshin shaker, that a lie lasts only for a minute. So here's the question. The Beinani, he gets himself into that zone where he's feeling Avas Hashem, but then he finishes davening, he goes out into the street, and he feels Ava for other things that are not Hashem. So maybe the whole time he was davening and he thought he was having Avas Hashem, it was a bluff. Maybe he's fooling himself. Because if it were authentic, it would never change. So the Alter Rebbe addresses this. And the Alter Rebbe says, I'm aware of the concept that Sfas emes tikun la'ad, that something that's real is unchanging. However, says the Alter Rebbe, afal pikein, notwithstanding the fact that generally truth should be constant, legabe medregas habeinanim, relatively speaking, you can't grade everybody according to the same test. You have to look at each person according to their level. So relatively speaking, nikras aveda tama be'emes la'amite shalahem, Their love of Hashem is authentic. It is genuine love. Shalahem, according to them, relative to who they are. Ish kefi medregase b'medregas habeininim. Each one of them, according to their level as beininim. In other words, you have to differentiate. You have to tailor-make the expectations to be appropriate to each individual, right? Like any good mechanech. Therefore, says the Alter Rebbe, V'hareini koire ba'avosam, I hereby declare or read about their ava, about the Beinini and his love of Hashem, shebetfilosim, that they feel during their davening, gam kein tzvas emes tikun lo'ad. I also call it tzvas emes, even though it doesn't last forever. But he gives an explanation. It doesn't last forever, but whenever they want to get it back, if they'll put in the work, they could always get it back. So that in itself is a certain type of constancy, that any time they want to put in and invest the effort, they could get the ava back. So in that way, it's constant. Now, what's interesting is one word here, hareini. We know the word hareini. We say it every day, hopefully, right? Hareini mekabel alei mitzvos esei shel v'yafta le'acha kamecha, right? Hareini, what does hareini mean? I hereby. It's in the first person. I, hareini, I. This is the only place in Tanya, except for the Hagdamas HaMalakit, where the Alter Rebbe is speaking as himself, but in the body of Tanya, in the Gan Prokim, it's the only place where the Alter Rebbe writes in first person. It's very strange. Why is the Alter Rebbe saying, hareini, I call it Tzfas Emes Tikun? Of course you say, you wrote the whole book. Everything here is what you say. You hear the question? Okay, so want to hear the answer? I'll tell you though, just a few minutes ago before you came in, I had the real event. The real event was the children's program that we had before I came in for the adults program. We bought some beautiful Chav Dalet Tevis children's program. We sang Nigunim. We had a raffle. Baruch Hashem, it was beautiful. So I told them this vort. They followed, by the way. And I asked if any of the boys there had the name Schneer. And I figured in a room full of 20 Lubavitcher kids, statistically speaking, I'll probably find one, right? So there were a few. And the one who was not too bashful and who was able to speak up, so I said to him, perfect. I don't know how old the kid was, maybe 6, 7, 8. I mean, I can't judge. But I'm not a good judge of how old a kid is. But I said to him, listen, I don't want to put you on the spot, so if you don't know, that's fine. But do you know that there's a minhag of saying a pasuk for yourself and for the Rebbe at the end of Shemoneh Esrei? He says, yeah, I'm aware of the minhag. So I said, what's the pasuk for Schneer? So he says, it's that pasuk you just said. I said, what is it? And he's like, he couldn't start it. I said, Tzvas Emes, and then he rattled off. I said, you say that 3 times a day, right? Shabbos, Yom Tov, Rosh Chodesh, say it 4 times. Yom Kippur, you say it 5 times. The Alter Rebbe's name was Schneer. Hareini koire. I read this pasuk. The Alter Rebbe is talking about himself because every single day he was saying that pasuk. Now, just to add to that, after I heard the vort and I was walking back to Olei Torah where they had the dinner for the young professionals, so I was thinking a little bit more about it. What a beautiful concept that is. The Alter Rebbe, we know, when the Rebbe told the story about the Alter Rebbe's Mesiras Nefesh for the Yeldis, for the woman who had given birth, and how he went and he cooked soup for her and he took care of her. The Rebbe makes a point of saying, look, you're talking about the Alter Rebbe in the middle of davening. Could you think of anything holier than the Alter Rebbe and the Alter Rebbe davening? I mean, that's like the pinnacle. So every time the Alter Rebbe davened, you could imagine what kind of davening you're talking about. Real Sfas Emes. And nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe didn't step back out of Shemoneh Esrei until he mentioned our davening. That's a nasi. 3 times a day, 4 times on Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, and Yom Tov, 5 times in Yom Kippur. The Alter Rebbe didn't finish davening his tefillah as a tzaddik with real Sfas Emes Tikkun Lad until he mentioned on the rest of us that we're also included. The nasi lifts us all up to his level. Beautiful thought. At any rate, I want to now focus on the life of the Alter Rebbe, specifically, as we said, the last few months, which coincide with a period of great turmoil historically in the world. Even those who are not familiar with Chabad history and Jewish history are very familiar with this period of time, which are the Napoleonic Wars. A little bit of a background. There was a revolution in France in the late 1700s, the 1790s. That revolution threw out the king. That's putting it nicely. They chopped his head off with a guillotine and his whole family. And they started a republic. And that was a balagan. I mean, I'm not giving the whole French history, but they attempted to get rid of the monarch and install some type of republic. And it was the first French Republic. And the thing was a disaster. And along came a nobody. He didn't come from royal stock. I mean, a monarch is a hereditary position, right? You have to have yichus. Came a guy named Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, and he wasn't from royal lineage. He was a soldier, career soldier. And you want to know? Where's Maisha Meisels? I remember one time. Remember our Shabbos on Long Island? What's it called? East Hampton. Remember the Shabbos in East Hampton? This was years ago. Maisha Meisels told me a great vort. You remember the vort you told me? I'm going to remind you right now. That they asked Napoleon, how did he become the emperor of France and then at one point the emperor of basically all of Europe? He was a nobody. How did he rise to such prominence? So he said to them, after the revolution, after they threw out the king, the crown was lying on the floor and nobody bothered to bend over and pick it up. So I picked it up and I put it on, and that's how I became the emperor. Remember you told me that? I think, by the way, that itself, even though Napoleon was a real klippa, as we're going to discuss, you can learn something from everything. You can learn even from Napoleon. Sometimes the only reason why an opportunity hasn't been seized is just because nobody bothered to seize it. And comes along somebody who says, hey, you know what? This thing isn't being done, but it can be done. And it should be. Right? Looking at Menachem. Okay. So Napoleon, he rose from out of nowhere. He becomes this emperor. And he is expanding across, he was a soldier, so he was a military tactician. He is spreading across Europe. And he's not just winning battles, but he is applying policy. See, Napoleon, interestingly, he was an emperor, and so in that respect, he was sort of a throwback to the monarchy, but he at least ostensibly represented the ideals of the revolution. The revolution was a leftist movement to throw out authority. So, liberty, fraternity, equality, those were the ideals of the revolution. Napoleon officially stood for those ideas, liberty, fraternity, equality, and he was a liberator. In other words, he was giving rights to people who never had rights. Because if you think about it, how was Europe run for centuries, for millennia? Is you had an absolute monarch who ruled by divine right. That means every political scientist of the day would say, who's the king? Why should he rule? What do you mean? Because the Eibishter installed him. It was a concept, everyone understood that a king is a representative of Hashem. It's interesting because Chassidus says the same thing. It says that a head of state is like an antenna. The hashpah that comes into the world through the Ayin Sorim, the 70 ministering angels, which represent each country, the 70 ummahs, have, like the 70 wolves surrounding the one lamb. So the nations, the proto-nations that are enumerated in Parshas Noach, there are 70 of them. There's 70 ministering angels. A head of state, a president, a king, or whoever, is like one of those, but he's the embodiment on earth, and he sort of acts as a conduit for all the hashpah, all of the affluence of blessing for the country over which he rules. And that's how it was understood. A king is God's representative, and you don't mess with him. So came Napoleon, and he sort of rode in on the revolutionary ideas, and he was a liberator. And he was going around giving rights to people that they never had before. Now, included in those to whom he was giving rights were an oppressed, disenfranchised minority in Europe known as the Jews. The Jews didn't have rights. I mean, the Jews had less rights than everybody else. And Napoleon came along and he started giving rights to Jews. And people were very excited about this, to the extent that even in the Hasidic world, many of the Hasidic Rebbes, the Tzaddikim, Talmidei HaMagid, were very pro-Napoleon. In fact, they almost all looked favorably upon Napoleon coming into Eastern Europe, hoping that he would bring some of the liberation into Eastern Europe that he had already installed in Western Europe. And there was really one dissenter. There was one opposition among the Hasidic Rebbes, meaning the Talmidei HaMagid, and that was the Alter Rebbe. And in fact, there's a letter, the Alter Rebbe wrote a letter to Maisha Meisels, great chassid, Maisha Meisels, or Meislish. In fact, the letter is in the book Beis Rebbe. It's also in the Igros Kodesh of the that's as different from the Igeros HaKodesh. Igeros HaKodesh is a part of Tanya. Igros Kodesh are letters that the Alter Rebbe wrote and were compiled. He wrote a letter, the Alter Rebbe wrote a letter to Maisha Meisels, and he tells Maisha Meisels, he says, Napoleon is a klippah, he's a klippah kosher, he's a bad guy, there's a koyach hatoma to him, he's bad stuff, he's a spiritual impurity. And if he's going to succeed, and he's going to conquer Eastern Europe, it will be materially beneficial for the Jews. They will have rights and they'll have material opportunities, but it will be spiritually devastating. It will be spiritually devastating. It will lead to assimilation, and the Jewish people will be destroyed. We cannot let him win. We have to support the Tsar. And in fact, this same Maisha Meisels, to whom the letter was written, actually stood up, as a chassid does, when his Rebbe tells him something's important, and he voted with his feet, and he actually helped, he assisted tangibly the effort of the Russians in defeating Napoleon. What's the story? I'm sure many of us are aware at least a little bit of it because it's mentioned in a Hayom Yom. There's the Hayom Yom of Yud Tes Adar Sheni. Anybody has a birthday Yud Tes Adar Sheni? Anyone who's Baki in Hayom Yom? You know the Hayom Yom Yud Tes Adar Sheni? Okay, we'll get to it. Maisha Meisels was a polyglot. He was multilingual. He spoke French and German, Russian, Polish. So the Alter Rebbe told him that he should use his knowledge of languages to get hired by French intelligence. And that when he'll be hired by the French intelligence, he'll have inside information, and then he should smuggle out the information to the Russians to give them an advantage. In other words, to be a spy. So Maisha Meisels was a spy for the Russians against the French. And in fact, there was one very pivotal contribution that he made. It's known that the French, when they were coming into Eastern Europe and they came into Russia, they would attack the armories. We all know what an armory is, right? Like that, there's an armory in Brooklyn. They don't use it for an armory anymore. They use it for the Satmar Chassidim to make their Chaf Aleph Kislev. But you know what an armory is? No? An armory is a place where armies keep their stuff. It's full of, what?
Mitzvah things.
Mitzvah tanks, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's where they keep their armaments. That's where they keep their weapons. So if you can go and attack an armory, you're cutting off the military supply. It's pretty devastating. So the French had already done this, and they were next plotting to hit the armory in Vilna. Vilna had an armory, and Maisha Meisels lived in Vilna, which that's a story for another time, but Vilna was a bastion of Hisnagdus, of opposition to Chassidus. And there were a few great Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe who lived in Vilna who were instrumental in fighting those battles. But that's maybe a story for another time, maybe a Yutes Kislev. But at any rate, Maisha Meisels is the one who found out the French were plotting to hit the armory in Vilna. He got news to the Russians before it happened. They were able to stave off the attack. I mean, normally they only had a certain amount of guards guarding an armory, but then they reinforced the troops, and this was considered extremely pivotal to the Russian, ultimately to the Russian victory. So, and in fact, the Tsar had instructed his army to provide any support that Rabbi Baruchovich will ask for, because he was considered to be such an important asset to the state, to the Russian monarchy. Okay, so, I forgot the Yud Tessa, the Sheni. So the famous story. What was this story? Maisha Meisels, one time, he's in the war room with a bunch of French generals. And they have the maps open, and they're looking where they're going, where the armies are, where they're going to move them. And he's the interpreter. And all of a sudden, the door flew open. He said, the door flew open so violently, I thought it was the enemy. I thought we were being attacked. We were all going to be killed. But then I looked, and I saw it was Napoleon himself. Napoleon, he was the emperor. He had generals at this point who did, who worked on actual battle plans. So he wasn't expecting to see Napoleon. Napoleon barged in. He says, Napoleon looks at me. I looked a little bit different. Maisha Meisels looked like a From Yid, right? And so he's standing there, Orthodox Jew amongst, these generals. And Napoleon, he says, immediately looks at me like I'm funny, something's out of place. And he walked right up to me. He says, you're a spy. And then he took his hand and he put it on my heart. And Napoleon, apparently, he was sort of like a human polygraph test, right? That could read the heart rate. And he could tell if a guilty person was, if his heart was responding like a guilty person, he could tell. So he came over and he says to Maisha Meisels, you're a spy. And then he puts his hand right on Maisha Meisels' heart. Maisha Meisels says, what did we learn from the Alter Rebbe? That the brain has to rule over the heart. So I thought to myself, you know what? I'm not afraid. And that's it. I reacted like an innocent person. And Napoleon felt that and he was like, it's okay, good. And he left. It saved his life. So let's tell the story now of the last few months of the Alter Rebbe's life. Where should we begin? I think the story really begins Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, we know, is a day of devastation historically for the Jewish people. Many dates throughout history, or many events throughout history occurred on that date. On Tisha B'Av, Tov Kuf Ayin Beis, the summer of 1812, on the day of Tisha B'Av, Napoleon entered Russia. He crossed the border, the boundary, into Russia. Okay. From Tisha B'Av until Erev Rosh Chodesh Elul, so we're talking 20 days, from the 9th of Av till the 29th of Av, Napoleon was moving at an incredibly fast pace. So much so that from having just entered Russia, just having crossed the border on Tisha B'Av, already Chav Tes Av, 20 days later, less than 3 weeks, he's already holding by Liadi. Now, the Alter Rebbe, we know that the Alter Rebbe spent most of his life in Liozna, but following the second imprisonment, the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned twice. So the first liberation was the liberation that we celebrate Yud Tes Kislev. Then there was a second imprisonment and a second liberation, which was the liberation of Gimel de Chanukah. After the second liberation, the Alter Rebbe didn't want to go back to Liozna, and he made his new home in Liadi. So the Alter Rebbe lived in Liadi from Tov Kuf Samach Aleph, that's 1801, until Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel, until 1813, meaning the very end of his life, the last 12 years of his life. The Alter Rebbe left Liadi only because Napoleon was literally hours away from entering the town. And he knew that it was not safe for him, that if Napoleon comes into the town, it's not going to be good. So from Tisha B'Av, when Napoleon entered Russia, until Chof Tes, the 29th of Av, 20 days later, which was Erev Rosh Chodesh Elul, which was also Erev Shabbos that year. Rosh Chodesh Elul was on a Shabbos. On an Erev Shabbos, the Alter Rebbe with his entire family picked up from the place where they'd been living for 12, 13 years, and they left. On an Erev Shabbos. On an Erev Shabbos. You understand what that means on an Erev Shabbos? I mean, just to try to wrap our minds around it, we know there's a famous story about Yud Tes Kislev. When they came and when they took the Alter Rebbe away to prison, when they brought him toward Peterburg, you know the story on Erev Shabbos, when the Alter Rebbe refused to travel. And he told them, I'm not going to travel because it's Erev Shabbos. And what happened? The axle broke. And then they went to fix the axle, and then the horse died. And no matter what they did, they couldn't get the wagon to budge. They understood the Alter Rebbe was using some type of powers to make this happen. And finally they begged him. They said, Rebbe, fine, let us just get to the village. We're not going to continue traveling. We'll just get to a nearby village. He told them, no, we're not going to budge. And they spent Shabbos at that spot. And in fact, there was a tree that grew there. It was outside of the town of Neville, and there were people who knew where it was for many, many generations afterwards. So the Frierdiker Rebbe once said, it's not such a miracle that the Alter Rebbe was able to disable the wagon so that they would be forced not to travel on Shabbos. Because a tzaddik will never be brought to sin. So for this we know he has divine protection. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes, what's the miracle is, it happened so many hours before Shabbos. It was hours before Shabbos, and the Alter Rebbe was saying, no, I'm not going to travel. So you see miracles happen in the Alter Rebbe's behalf that he shouldn't have to travel Erev Shabbos. Chof Tes Elul, Erev Shabbos, Erev Rosh Chodesh, Chof Tes of Erev Rosh Chodesh Elul, they were traveling on Erev Shabbos. Not only they traveled on Erev Shabbos, they didn't get to the town where they spent Shabbos until 30 minutes before Shabbos. So it was a serious issue. It was life and death. It was no joke. The Alter Rebbe left with his family. He left with all of his possessions. I think there were 60 wagons. They were also accompanied by a military guard. This was not an honor guard. It wasn't for pomp and circumstance. It was for protection because it was a war zone and the Alter Rebbe was a targeted individual. So they left Liadi. They got about 10 miles away, and the Alter Rebbe said, stop, we got to go back. He told the rest of the entourage, you continue at your pace. I'm going to go back with some of the army, with some of the soldiers, and we're going to catch up with you. So the Alter Rebbe with some of the soldiers, they went back to Liadi. They went to the house. The Alter Rebbe says, check the house, make sure that everything was taken from the house. They went back in the house and they found a few articles that were left there, a pair of slippers, a couple of other objects. So they brought them out, they brought them to the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe says, now burn the place to the ground. And they burnt the Alter Rebbe's home to the ground. They got back in the wagons, and they turned around, they caught up with the rest of the entourage. Hours later, the French army arrived with none other than Napoleon himself. And Napoleon was asking, bring me to the home of Rabbi Barachovich. And when they brought him there and he saw it was on fire, he was irate. After he saw that the house was burnt down, he sent out emissaries all over town to ask if anyone has an object they might have received from the Alter Rebbe. What was this? The Alter Rebbe understood very well what was going to happen. That's why he burnt down the house. Napoleon, like the Alter Rebbe says, was a klippa. He had a koyach hatuma. And he wanted to get hold of an object that the Alter Rebbe had owned, because an object that a tzaddik owns has a connection to the tzaddik, and thereby he was going to try to do some type of, spiritual, some black magic. And that's why the Alter Rebbe burnt everything down. From this, by the way, we can see the power that's in an object that was handled by a tzaddik. We know how the Rebbe gave out dollars and kuntresim, and these objects have a holiness, have a power to them, a real power. It's not just a keepsake, a memento, nostalgia. There's a real power in an object that was handled by a tzaddik.
What power of Klippa?
So it could be, so Klippa could use that power.
That's what I'm saying.
That's the point. There's a power to the object, and if you use it right, you use it right. But God forbid the opposite could be. And that's how Napoleon wanted to do. He wanted to get a hold of that object and use it in a negative way. So at any rate, they made it to the town about a half an hour before Shabbos, and during that whole time they were fleeing. And it's interesting. The Mittler Rebbe says that they would be receiving news from the front. It wasn't like you could turn on CNN, but word would travel through messengers, and they had the army with them. So seemingly the army had some type of a way of communicating, getting messages from the front. So they would get messages. Obviously the messages would take time. So they would find things out after it happened. I don't know the lag time, but the point is, the Mittler Rebbe said that all during this whole tkufa, while they were running, he says the Alter Rebbe would be openly discussing the current events, and he would be talking about Napoleon and the Tsar and the wars. And he said there was such Ruach HaKodesh, open nevuah. The Alter Rebbe would be describing what's happening, and everything that he was describing would happen exactly as he described it. The Mittler Rebbe says during this time, these last months, the Alter Rebbe was revealing things he never revealed before, which we'll get to. I want to talk about at the end. So they're fleeing. When they would come to a fork in the road, it was the Alter Rebbe who would decide which way they're going to go. Now I should mention, they left. Let me just make sure everyone's awake. Do you remember when they left? What day they left Liadi? Chavtes. Oh, very good. Erev Rosh Chodesh Elul, which is a month before Rosh Hashanah. When they left, the Alter Rebbe said, it's very important that we should be in Poltava for Rosh Hashanah. The Alter Rebbe said it, everyone knew that, they knew that was the goal. And it was a reasonable goal. They would come to different forks in the road. The Alter Rebbe was the one who would say, not the army, not anyone else, he would say which way they're going. Sometimes the Alter Rebbe would look from his carriage. He was the third carriage in the procession. Sometimes he would get out of his carriage, he would walk into the fork in the road, he would lean on his cane, and he would enter a state of dveikus, and then he would point one direction or the other, and that's the way they would go. At one point, they came to a fork in the road. The Alter Rebbe gave his instructions. And the one who would implement it was a grandson, the Alter Rebbe's grandson, the Mittler Rebbe's son, Reb Menachem Nochem. It occurred one time, they were traveling, and they were many miles after a certain fork in the road, and the Alter Rebbe asked, when are we arriving at such and such village? Now that village was not on the way that they were going anymore, it was on the way that they had just not gone. So when Menachem Nochem heard this, he realized he messed up, that he took them on the wrong way, that somehow there was a misunderstanding. He went not the way the Alter Rebbe had wanted them to go. And he was panicked. And he came to the Alter Rebbe and he says, we're on the wrong path. We can turn around right now and go back. And the Alter Rebbe said, fortunate is the grandfather whose grandson follows in his way. Unfortunate is the grandfather who follows in the grandson's way. No, we're not turning back. Now that we're heading this way, we're going to continue. And they did not reach Poltava for Rosh Hashanah. And for the rest of his life, Reb Menachem Nochem blamed himself that a few months later, what transpired is what we know, what we're commemorating tonight on Chof Dalet Tevis, that the Alter Rebbe was nostalgic that he passed on. And the Alter Rebbe's grandson always felt that if he would have gone the right way and he would have made it to Poltava for Rosh Hashanah, then this whole journey would not have ended as it did. Rosh Hashanah somehow it was known. I don't know how tzaddikim know these things, but however they know, that if you could blow shofar before the other tzaddikim, then your army that you're supporting is going to win. So the Alter Rebbe was, if he would blow shofar first, Rosh Hashanah, we're talking about Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel, then the Tsar is going to win. And if the Tzaddiket Poilin, meaning the other Talmidei HaMagid, including Yisrael Koznitzer, the Koznitzer Magid, Aaron Karliner, and in fact, even Reb Levi Yitzchak Berditchever. In fact, on the way over here, I was talking to my son, and I mentioned Reb Levi Yitzchak Berditchever was one of the pro-Napoleon Tzaddiket Poilin. And my son said, Reb Levi Yitzchak Berditchever, I mean, he was so much on the same page with the Alter Rebbe. So, Ulay Yesh Leima, this is from the Boich. But I said, you know, Levi Yitzchak Berditchever was such a lover of Jews. Maybe he had so much compassion that he just wanted it to be easier on them. Pasha begashmias, and that's the L'Kula Alma. The Alter Rebbe agreed that if Napoleon's going to win, begashmias, materially, it's going to be beneficial. It's going to be an easier life. At any rate, Rosh Hashanah, the Koznitzer Magid, the Yisroel Koznitzer, he got up before dawn, went to mikveh, and he started davening Shachars right at the first possible moment, and he was davening quicker than he ever davened before in his life until he got to Tkiyas, and then he did the Tkiyas, and then after he finished, he said, the Litvak chapped it already. The Talmidei HaMagid used to call the Alter Rebbe the Litvak, because they were Pelisher, and he was a Litvisher. He was from Belarus, which was Lita. He spoke different. They used to say Git Yomtiv. He said Gut Yomtiv, right? He was a Litvak, a Kalta Litvak, like they say. That's why he was Moichin, he was Chabad, and they were the Pelisha, the emotional, Chagas. At any rate, so he said that Litvak, he already chapped it, he already got it. How did the Alter Rebbe beat them? Well, everyone who goes on Mivtzayim, or anyone who has Rachmanas on their wife before they go to shul knows about this Eitzah, right? You don't have to do Tkiyas in davening. You can do Tkiyas first thing in the morning. So the Alter Rebbe got up, he did Tkiyas, and then he went and davened. Later on, that Rosh Hashanah, the Alter Rebbe was speaking to the Mittler Rebbe. And he said to the Mittler Rebbe, he says, things have changed. Now remember, now we're talking about 41 days, is that the right math? Since Napoleon entered Russia, from Tisha B'Av till Rosh Hashanah. And for these 41 days, Napoleon, he's winning every battle and he's moving fast, he's trucking. And Rosh Hashanah, the Alter Rebbe says to the Mittler Rebbe, he says, it's changed. There's been a change. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. He's going to reach Moscow. He's going to take Moscow. But then he's going to get turned around and he's going to have to run away, and that's going to be his ultimate defeat, his complete downfall. And when the Chassidim heard this, they were overjoyed. And Sudas Rosh Hashanah that year was exceptionally lebedik, and they said l'chaim, that Napoleon's having his downfall. Now, Erev Yom Kippur, Napoleon took Moscow, meaning 9 days later, right? Yom Kippur is the 10th of Tishrei, so Erev Yom Kippur is the 9th of Tishrei. So the Alter Rebbe said, on Aleph Tishrei, on Rosh Hashanah, he's going to take Moscow. That's what happened 9 days later, Erev Yom Kippur. Napoleon took Moscow. Afterwards, the Mittler Rebbe came to the Alter Rebbe and he was crying. And he said, he already took Moscow. And he's still there. He's still there. He's not going away. You said he's going to take Moscow, but then he's going to get turned around. He's going to run away, and that's going to be his ultimate downfall. He took Moscow, and he's staying in Moscow. The Alter Rebbe was davening, and he had his tefillin on. He said to the Mittler Rebbe, says, you see, I'm wearing tefillin, and I'm only going to tell you the truth. I told you he's going to take Moscow, but he's only going to hold on to it for a while, and then I'm telling you he's going to run, and that's going to be his ultimate downfall. We see also that sometimes the Rebbe tells us something's going to happen, and it doesn't happen in the timeline that we understand that it's going to happen. But in the end, what the Rebbe says is going to happen. And that's precisely what occurred. And it's something that historians study to this day. How Napoleon, who was so successful, was turned around and he had to leave Moscow. He had to retreat. So when the Rebbe tells us what's going to happen, sooner or later, that's exactly what's going to happen. So actually, there's a vort in Lekutei Sichos. The Rebbe speaks about that between the commandment to make a mishkan in Truma, Tetzaveh, you have a kisisa. Kisisa is chet ha'egel. So you have an interruption of a very negative thing. But between Vayakel and Pekudei, Vayakel is Maisha is gathering the Yidden. Pekudei is they actually put together the Mishkan. There's never a hefsek. Some years, Vayakel and Pekudei are separate. So you've got to wait a little bit. You've got to wait till the next Shabbos. But there's not a hefsek. Because once Moshe gathers the Jews and says, this is what's going to happen, this is what's going to happen, Kinderlach. So at any rate, the Mittler Rebbe was crying. He took Moscow. He's in Moscow. He's still there. He's holding it. The Alter Rebbe told him, don't worry. You wait and you see. He's going to get turned around from Moscow. Now, I should mention that during that same exact kufa where the Alter Rebbe is telling the Mittler Rebbe, don't worry, let's rewind a few days to Shabbos Shuvah, the Shabbos between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. The Alter Rebbe was weeping. And the Mittler Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek came to him, and they asked him about it. And he said that he's thinking about after the French have to retreat from Moscow, it's still not over. He says, because as they're retreating and they're going back to France, he says, I see already the devastation to the Jewish communities that's going to be inflicted by these French soldiers as they go through Belarus, as they go through White Russia. And the Alter Rebbe was weeping about this. And indeed, that was the case, that even after they were defeated, but there were pogroms as the French retreated back through Belarus. Never pass up an opportunity to inflict violence upon the Jews, I guess. So, it's a month later. Okay, Erev Yom Kippur is when Napoleon took Moscow. Okay, a month later. Now, it's 2 months later. 2 months and 1 day later. So from Erev Yom Kippur until Yud Kislev, 2 months, 1 day. It was Motzei Shabbos Parshas Vayetze. The Alter Rebbe turned to the Chassidim and he said, this is it. It's here. The downfall is coming. He's going to be run out of Moscow. Okay? 2 months after Napoleon conquered Moscow. And it still didn't happen. But on the 15th of Kislev, 5 days after that Motzei Shabbos when the Alter Rebbe said it's going to happen. By the way, does anyone know what the 15th of Kislev is? Tezvav Kislev? You have any Chavra Kedisha? It's fasting. Very good. So shortest day of the year, yeah. So the Alter Rebbe was Nechaver Kedisha, and he would fast that day, as was his custom all his life, or at least even since his young years when he became a member of Chaver Kedisha. So when he broke the fast at the end of Tes Vav Kislev, at the break fast, he said, L'chaim, today he was chased out of Moscow. Now remember, I told you before, there's no CNN. You had to wait for news to come from the front. They waited. Finally, what day did they get news? Did they get confirmation that Napoleon was chased out of Moscow? Let me see if anyone knows here Chassidic trivia, although we can't call it trivia because nothing in Chassidishkeit is trivial. But there's a day of the year that's called Yom HaBesura, the day of good tidings. Does anyone know the Yom HaBesura, the day of good tidings? The day, a lot of good things happen on that day, starting with the liberation of the Alter Rebbe. Yud Tes Kislev is Yom HaBesura. There's a Sefer, Shailas Tshuvas Min HaShamayim, and over there it says that Yud Tes Kislev is Yom HaBesura. So on Yud Tes Kislev they got the news that indeed it was, as the Alter Rebbe had said, Napoleon had been chased out of Moscow. There it was. Now, they were still not done running. They had to, they were living out of wagons. And they couldn't go back. Remember, the land had been devastated. There were still soldiers there, even though they were retreating. They had to find a place to settle. And in fact, this is an important thing to remember. The Mittler Rebbe was not present with the Alter Rebbe at his Histalkos, because the Mittler Rebbe was sent on a special shlichus to scout out possible towns where they would settle. And when the Alter Rebbe was Nistalik Chof Dalet Tevis, the Mittler Rebbe was in Kremenchuk. Kremenchuk was a Chassidish shtat, or became even more in the later generations. So the Mittler Rebbe was scouting out that maybe they were going to live there, and that's where he was when the Alter Rebbe was Nistalik. But at any rate, a few weeks after they got the news Napoleon had been chased out of Moscow, on the 8th of Tevis, they arrived in the village of Piena. Piena, we know Piena because that's the last place where the Alter Rebbe lived. And he lived there for 16 days. Now, I mentioned to you before, the Mittler Rebbe had said that during that whole Tekufa, that 140 some days, that the Alter Rebbe was speaking open Nevuah the whole time. I should add also that the Alter Rebbe was revealing Chassidus on a totally new level the entire time, and especially those last 16 days, from the 8th of Tevis till the 24th of Tevis, 2.5 weeks, the Alter Rebbe was revealing Chassidus on a level unprecedented. And during those 16 days, the Alter Rebbe wrote 2 very, very important works of Chassidus. He wrote what later became Simin Chof of Igeras HaKodesh, and an essay known as Nefesh HaShvela, the humble soul. And they both are about the same topic. What topic are they both about? The Alter Rebbe brought out a whole new perspective on the value of physicality. That it's not just like we think, in Tanya it talks about, the Alter Rebbe brought out, that's me, perspective on the value of, yeah, that's what I sound like. I gotta stop talking. It's always weird to hear your own voice recorded. We know in Tanya, in Parokim Lamed Hey, Lamed Vov, Lamed Zayin, so over there it talks about mitzvahs maisias, dira b'tachtenim, but over there, what does the Alter Rebbe say? He says, why is maisa important? Why is the stuff that you do in the physical world with a body important? He says, because it's a yisna oim and a chayshich. That basically, because this world is the lowest world, so the Eibishter appreciates it most. It's like, when you're really thirsty, you appreciate a glass of water. So when it's in a dark place, you really appreciate the light. in the later Chassidus that the Alter Rebbe is writing, mamish, the last days of his life, he brought out a whole new level. He starts explaining, no, in the whole state of Ishtalshlis, in all of the worlds, the only place where you can really experience the essence of godliness is in the physical world. That in the spiritual world, that's Giluyim, that's fireworks. But down here, with a body, with a simple action, that's Atzmus. That, by the way, is one of the themes of Bossi Lagani. I know we're coming up to Yud Shvat, and Chassidim are thinking already in terms of Bossi Lagani and Yud Shvat and Kabbalas and Nesiyas. That's one of the themes there in the Maimer as well. That in the physical world, you have the greatest ability to actually have godliness. That in the spiritual world, you see godliness. In the physical world, you could actually be godliness because you could become an extension of Hashem's will by surrendering yourself to His mitzvahs. At any rate, and it's all because the physical world it reflects the idea of Hashem's atzmos. That just like Hashem has no precedent, nothing came before Him, nothing caused Him to be. The physical world is the only place in all Seder Ishtalshus that sees its reality as if it came from nowhere, as if it just exists by itself. And even though it's incorrect, but the fact that it can even see it that way shows that there's a certain truth to it, which is that the physical world is the one place we can actually become one with God. Not like in the spiritual worlds where they watch God, they behold God, they're impressed by God. This is where you become one with Him, through mitzvahs maisis. The Frierdiker Rebbe wrote that from the Chassidus that the Alter Rebbe wrote, B'Seif Yamav, in the last days of his life, he brought out He opened up a new mayon. We talk about Chassidus as Hafatzas Hamayonis. So there was a new mayon, a new spring opened up just those last few days. Now I also think it's kedai for us to think about this, something that the Rebbe pointed out, that it was dafke in the end of the Alter Rebbe's life, Baal Medain, in this physical world, where the deepest chassidus came out. And the Rebbe said that a tzaddik, as he approaches the climax, the culmination of his life, so the essence of his teachings start to become revealed. And I think, for us in Derech Shvi, it's so clear, things that the Rebbe was I don't want to say hinting at, because the Rebbe spoke clearly, but saying in a gentle way in Tafshin Yud Aleph, the Rebbe was saying it in such a powerful way. Tafshin Nun Aleph, Tafshin Nun Beis. The Rebbe brought the essence of his teachings, the core of his message, which is Mashiach, that came out in the last sichas, in the later years, in the most revealed and most potent way. And the Rebbe said this on the Alter Rebbe. We see this with a tzaddik. It's interesting because in the world, you have a teacher, you have a chacham, and he's considered an expert, and everybody relies on him. But then, towards the end of his life, people don't rely on him because they say, maybe he's not so sharp anymore, maybe he lost his edge. But with Talmidei Chachomim, and a tzaddik, and especially a nasi, it's the exact opposite. Because his whole life is spirituality. So even though Taka in those days, the Alter Rebbe's body was deteriorating. The Alter Rebbe physically, because of the traveling and the journey and the Agmas Nefesh, he physically was getting weaker. But spiritually, he was getting stronger and stronger and stronger, so that his deepest chassidus, which was the core of his message all along, was coming out in those last days. Chof Dalet Tevis, as we mentioned, was ultimately the Alter Rebbe's Histalkus. It was a Motzei Shabbos. The Alter Rebbe Daven Maidav made Havdalah. Actually, he made Havdalah and Daven Maidav in that order. And Motzei Shabbos, he was Nistalik in Piena. And he was buried nearby in Hadich. Now, that's basically the biography. But I wanted to also speak a little bit about some of the deeper significance of the Alter Rebbe's opposition to Napoleon, especially in light of some things that the Rebbe said, particularly in the later years. The Alter Rebbe vehemently opposed Napoleon, as we said at the very beginning, and he gave the reason why. That Napoleon would bring rights and material prosperity to the Jews, but spiritually it would be devastating for them. It would lead to assimilation. As I mentioned, Napoleon was a liberating force. He represented the revolution, which was a leftist movement to throw out the established authority, the monarchy. And basically what that means is that the spirit of liberation that Napoleon represented was a poison, a spiritual poison, which had to be opposed at all costs. Now, here's the thing. In Tafshin Nun Beis, interestingly enough, we're mentioning how the Rebbe's deepest teachings came out in the later Sichas. Shabbos Mavorchem Chedesh Tevis, Shabbos Parshas Vayeshev. There was the French Fabrengen. There were a group of French Balabatim, people who had contributed a bunch of money to the yeshiva in Benoit. And the Rebbe was clearly acknowledging them. And at one point they sang Haderes V'Amuna to the tune of the Masayeh, the way the Rebbe taught it, Simchas Torah Tav Shin Lamed Daled. Simchas Torah Tav Shin Lamed Daled, the Rebbe sang Haderes V'Amuna. So they sang that. And the Rebbe started speaking about Tzarfas. Tzarfas is the biblical Hebrew for France. And how it's Begematria 770, which is also Paratzta, which means breaking forth, bursting through barriers. And started speaking about how French values the liberation ideology, the throwing off of old convention and old authority, which used to be spiritual poison and which the Alter Rebbe therefore had to oppose, has been transformed into a positive force that we can use. I think it's important to point this out. The Rebbe did not change the position from what the Alter Rebbe established. The Rebbe stuck to the Alter Rebbe's position and said that this is how the Shitta is applied in our day and age because conditions are different. I don't want to bring an elephant in the room and distract everybody, but maybe it's a good mashal. Maybe it's a terrible mashal because it'll distract people with a whole new train of thought. But for instance, if you guys can just indulge me and then promise to end this conversation and go back to our main conversation. But as a mashal, I want to give as a dogma, people who don't understand the Rebbe's Shitta about Eretz Yisrael might think that the Rebbe Rashab was anti-Zionist and the Frierdiker Rebbe was anti-Zionist, and the Rebbe was such a big supporter of the political and military strength of Israel. And but the truth is, there's not a reversal of position. I mean, in Hayem Yem, which is the Rebbe's Sefer, he includes teachings of the Frierdiker Rebbe which say how people shouldn't put their hopes in having a political state, and that it's false hopes, and it even says worse, more negative things than that. So the Rebbe wasn't a Zionist, he never became a Zionist. But the way to ensure safety and security of Jews was to support the state as a political and military entity. So it wasn't a change in the policies, it was a change in the way the facts on the ground had changed, and therefore, to remain consistent, you have to change the way that you apply things. So again, I said I don't want to get off into that as a whole side conversation, but the Rebbe's approach was the same as the Alter Rebbe's approach. It's just in the Alter Rebbe's time, this liberalism of French revolutionary idealism was a klippa. It was about prikas oil. Liberalism was just throwing off all of the convention, all of the authority. And why? Because remember, we might not be able to relate to this so well because we never had a king. So we think a king is a weird thing. But people believed in kings. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the talk. Why did people believe in kings? Because they believe a king had divine right. They thought he was a representative of God. So the reason people believed in kings is because they had some level of recognition that there's a creator. So it was a wholesome thing. It was a good thing that they represented a king. And then for the revolutionaries to come in and get rid of the king, it smacked of atheism, or Yedei Asur Beinu Mekaven Limned Bei. It was throwing off the yoke of heaven and fighting against divine authority. Now, by the way, it's interesting. You're going to say, hold on a second. There was an American Revolution too. So the Rebbe actually mentioned that. The American Revolution, 1776, which was during the time when the Alter Rebbe was in Mezrich. The Rebbe said that was a different kind of a revolution because the other revolutions were to throw off the yoke of heaven. It was against God. The American Revolution was using the belief in God, right? That all men were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that the founding fathers were all believers. Whether they were deists or theists, that's a discussion for another time, exactly what their theology was. But the point is, they believed in revolution because of their belief in God. And the Rebbe points out, and that's why America was successful, why America has had longevity. And in fact, I don't know if people realize this, but do you know the oldest existing government in the world? It's very surprising because, you go to Europe, you go to England, let's say, and you stay in a house that's 500 years old. It's not even a historical landmark. It's just houses are 500 years old. And in America, if something's 100 years old, it's ancient, right? I think the oldest Chabad house I've ever been in is in Marion Station, Pennsylvania. They bought a building that was built 1695, which is the times of the Baal Shem Tov. I think that's the oldest building that became a Chabad house. That's ancient. In America, 1695, that's ancient, right? In Europe, you see things 500 years, 600, 700. You go to Eretz Yisrael, things are 1,000 years, 2,000 years. The Kaisos are 2,000 years old, right? But surprisingly, what's the oldest continuously existing government in the world? The United States of America. So even though it was a revolution, but it was a theistic revolution, it was a revolution that was based on freedom of religion, or like the Rebbe pointed out, not freedom from religion, but freedom of religion, freedom to practice religion and the belief in God, and therefore it was mevareches, it was blessed, and it continues to this day. The French, their revolution, I remember I told you, they threw out the king and they put in a republic. The republic didn't last, I don't think it lasted a decade. But you know how many republics France has had since that revolution? I think they're in their 5th republic. I think with de Gaulle in the 50s, they started the 5th republic. It's still going till now. But every 50 years, they're changing it up, making a new government. Why? Because it wasn't based on God. And therefore, it's fleeting. It changes. It's based on humanism. It's based on, prikas oil. But here's the chiddush. The Rebbe said, that attitude of freedom, we could do whatever we want, we could throw off authority. At the time of the Alter Rebbe, it was poison, and it had to be addressed like that, and that's why the Alter Rebbe was Meiser Nefesh, Kipshutoi. We know that his fight against Napoleon, let's say it bluntly, the Alter Rebbe's fight against Napoleon is what precipitated in his demise. So he was Meiser Nefesh to fight that klippa. Yet the Rebbe comes out, Shabbos Morchem Chedesh Tevis, Parshas Vayeshev Tavshin and Beis, and the Rebbe says, now we can use it. He said the spirit of liberty, fraternity, equality, the French liberalism, the openness, we can use it. We're at a point now, we're so close to Mashiach, we don't have to be afraid of it using us. We have the Balabatishkeit. We own it. And the Rebbe pointed out, which is why we took their song. We took the Masayeh and we turned it into Ades Ve'amuna, L'chayei Lamim, which praises Hashem as the one who is eternal. and it exists forever. So we're the boss. We can use it. And the Rebbe even says an interesting thing there. There's a concept in Torah of following minhag hamakom, which is an interesting concept. The Torah in Yiddishkeit, you have to have your principles. You don't change. You don't veer. You don't adapt. And the Rebbe says, but yet in Torah there's a concept of minhag hamakom, that when you're in a place, you follow the style of the place. So the Rebbe said, what does that mean? That different times and junctures in history, there's a different ruach. And you have to know how to use it the right way. So in the time of the Alter Rebbe, leftist revolutionary liberation ideology had to be opposed at all costs. In our day, so close to Mashiach, we could use it. There are no limits. You can do anything you want. Nobody can stop you. You have all the freedom in the world. We can be as Jewish, as openly as we want to be. We just have to have the right attitude. We have to understand the opportunity that it affords us. Now, would any of us step forward and make that judgment call? No. But the Rebbe stood up in 1992 and he said, we came to a new place. We came to a new juncture in history. And that the things that used to be a curse are now blessings. So yeah, if your great-great-great-great-grandparents would have suddenly had the affluence and the freedom that you have, it would have been terrible for them. But the Rebbe says, let's hear this, that if you have affluence, you have money and opportunity and freedom, and you can go where you want and do what you want, and nobody can stop you, that's a blessing because you know how to use it. That's real Derech Shvi type stuff, right? Like the Alter Rebbe's Chassidim couldn't handle it. We can handle it. Okay? It wasn't our choice. It wasn't our Avodah. But we're Derech Shvi. We live in unique times. We live in a time where we can use something that used to be a curse. We could use it as a blessing. We could use it as an opportunity. See, we went a little bit over time already. So I'll just wrap up by saying, just like the Mittler Rebbe says, that in those last few months, there was open Ruach HaKodesh, and that the Alter Rebbe was explaining everything that was going on in the world and revealing new depths of Chassidus. I think it's kedai for us in Derech Shvi to remember how the last sichas, the Rebbe is describing reality. And the Rebbe is at the cutting edge, and he's telling us exactly what's happening, what's unfolding before our eyes. Serious stuff, exciting stuff. Okay, thanks.